The Army will find out whether so-called sustainable building materials will hold up to the wear and tear of military construction. It's using such materials to build new barracks for the 1st Multi-Domain Task Force at Joint Base Lewis-McChord near Tacoma, Washington. Joining me with more about this project, the Principal Deputy Assistant Army Secretary for Installations, Paul Farnan. Mr. Farnan, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
First of all, let's talk about what it is you're building and size and scope of the project, and then we'll get into what it is you're trying to do with it.
Sure. So it's a new barracks at Joint Base Lewis-McChord. I think it'll have about 168 beds, I think is what we're talking about. It's a 3-story building for our soldiers.
All right. And modern barracks are not like one big room with 168 people sleeping in bunks. These are almost like mini apartment type of situation?
Very much like the mini apartments. In fact, the new standard that the Army goes by, that Secretary Warmoth has approved, each soldier will have his or her own bedroom. And normally the configuration will be a shared suite. You'll have either 2 or 4 bedrooms with an adjoining living space, as well as a kitchen and either 1 or 2 bathrooms, depending on the number of soldiers. So very much is like an apartment.
And is this replacing an existing facility, or is this some expansionary need?
This is a new build for the increasing need for as soldiers move into JBLM.
Okay, and let's talk about the idea here of sustainable building materials. What does that actually mean?
Sure. So this actually originated, Congress put this into the NDAA in 2022, requiring each service to do so. One of the requirements was at least one of the services had to do a barracks project. And since neither the Navy or the Air Force had any barracks projects teed up, the Army decided we basically skinnied down our list to make it just the barracks. There were only a couple choices we had, and the JBLM barracks made the most sense after working through all of the issues with the whole team here. But basically, it's really looking at how we build the building. We want it to be sustainable. We want it to be resilient. We want it to be able to stand up to the changing conditions, the changing climate. We also want to look at how we build it. We want it to be energy efficient. We're looking at both our fiscal impact as well as our environmental impact, but at the same time, all along, making sure we have the very highest quality of life for the soldiers that are going to be living in this. So what we're looking at is, how do we make the building the most efficient, the most energy efficient to save energy? Can we incorporate renewable power, again, to save energy? Really looking at an integrated design of this building. We're not going to do life cycle cost analysis on individual components. We need to do it as the building as a whole and see how this is going to cost out throughout the years. One of the other requirements in the law was to look at the primary construction material. And so what the Corps has done, the Corps has actually been very proactive and forward-leaning as they're doing this, and they've been able to reduce the carbon content of our building materials by 30% as they're going through the design. But what I need to make sure I point this out, the quality of life for the soldiers remains the number one priority. So no matter what we're doing with the sustainability or resilience, it's still going to be a high-quality building for our soldiers to live in. And the cost has actually came in at 30% below the original estimate. So we're showing that we can build sustainably, we can include resilience, and it's not going to break the bank. We're still going to be fiscally responsible with the taxpayers' dollars.
And you are assured, or you have assurance, that even though it's 30% below cost and low carbon, that it will stand up for more than 5 years?
This barracks should still stand for 4 to 5 or 6 decades. The intended use is going to be, well into the end of the century. So, yes.
And this idea of low carbon materials, steel studs are low carbon relative to wood, that kind of thing?
So what they've done is they're using, for the steel part, they're increasing the recycled steel content, which reduces the carbon. And then for the cement portion, they've actually been able to change the concrete mixture to reduce, again, by 30% the carbon made from the cement. Because what most people don't know, concrete and cement is a major driver of carbon emissions really around the planet.
All right. We're speaking with Paul Farnan, Principal Deputy Assistant Army Secretary for Installations, Energy, and Environment, and talk about the heating, ventilating, air conditioning, because that represents real ongoing cost. Once the building is sitting there, you don't have to maintain the concrete anymore, but right. It has to be a living building.
Yeah. I don't want to get too technical because, Full disclosure, I am not an engineer, so I don't want to get into the Corps of Engineers' business. They know exactly what they're doing. But by building this way, by increasing the efficiency, by increasing the insulation of the walls, the envelope of the building, by using passive designs, the way we site the building to account for the solar radiation, in the colder climates, have the windows facing south to get the sun. How we do all that should reduce the energy demand of our building. And then we can the HVAC system doesn't have to work as hard. The more energy efficient the building is, the better the HVAC system will perform. So it all ties together, and that goes back to the point I made earlier, making sure we do a whole building, an integrated life cycle cost analysis, not just looking at what's the best HVAC component, but what's the best HVAC component for the design of this system.
And does this also extend to, say, the plumbing fixtures, too? Because water is a big issue there, and you don't want to put in mulching toilets necessarily in a barrack, so there's got to be some water.
Again, it's, quality of life is the priority, and we're going to make sure that we equip these buildings for what our soldiers need and to be able to live comfortably.
And by the way, you've mentioned the Corps. The Army Corps of Engineers is actually the construction agent.
Correct. They have been driving this train, and when I was out there for the groundbreaking a couple of weeks ago, I actually sat down with Colonel Sanford, the commander of the Seattle District of the Corps of Engineers, and she kind of talked me through what the process has been. My hat's off to the Seattle District. They're a very progressive organization, really forward-leaning and looking at new ideas, how we can build better, more innovative, and keep coming in under budget.
And are you documenting what's going on, and will you take metric measurements after the building is completed? Because the Army will have ongoing installation requirements for barracks and all sorts of facilities. Is this going to be something you're going to try to have a lessons learned retaining?
Absolutely. We've had many conversations with the Corps of Engineers because you're exactly right. We don't want to do just one and forget about this. We want the lessons that we learn from this to be able to apply to buildings across the Army. Our resilient building policy says this is how we should be building all facilities on all Army installations. We've never really built like this before. So it's important to get these projects under our belts, understand how it's done and what both the short-term and the long-term effects are. So the Corps, both Corps leadership here in D.C. as well as the Seattle District, they are absolutely going to be documenting everything. They're going to be sharing the lessons learned throughout the Corps of Engineers. Again, we're not going to wait 5 years till after the building's been occupied for a few years to see. This is happening now. So as we build it, as we do the design process, what works, what doesn't work, and start disseminating those lessons right away, because we can't afford to wait for 10 years to start incorporating these lessons.
And by the way, is Joint Base Lewis-McChord one of those facilities where the Army is trying out self-sustaining electrical generation? I know that's been a project in a few places.
So we are looking at self-contained generation everywhere. And the reason for that is because that's what's going to give us energy resilience. Our bases need to be able to operate if the grid goes down, whether from a natural disaster like a major hurricane or a cyber attack from an adversary that takes the grid down for weeks or months. The only truly resilient form of energy is self-contained generation. So we are working with local utilities across the country at every one of our bases, how we can increase the generation on our bases to provide that resiliency to enable our warfighting mission.
And there's really probably no one single way to do that. I imagine the particular climate of the area you're in, because otherwise you could just buy a bunch of expensive generators and stick them on, but that may or may not be a very viable solution fiscally.
You're absolutely correct. And in fact, if you look at how the commercial sector is doing this and how the public utilities are doing this, there's no one thing. In the Southwest, they're putting a lot of solar. In the Midwest, they're putting a lot of wind. They're doing geothermal where that's appropriate. We're doing the exact same thing because we can't just buy a bunch of expensive generators because all of those run on diesel fuel. That diesel fuel has to come from somewhere. And yeah, we might have a 7 or 14-day supply of diesel fuel on our base, but if there's a cyber attack on that grid and it goes down for a few months, what happens to our power on day 15 when we're in on diesel fuel? Because if the grid's not energizing the base and the community, there's no one pumping diesel fuel to deliver it to us. So again, it has to be fully self-contained. If it comes from outside the wire, it's vulnerable to interruption. And so based on the geography, we are looking at what is the most appropriate form of generation. In Washington State at JBLM, it might be one thing. It's not going to be the same thing as Fort Huachuca in Arizona, and it's not going to be the same thing as Fort Drum in upstate New York.
And what's the timeline for the construction of that barracks, by the way, to bring it back around?
The contract has been awarded. It was awarded this spring. Looks like about September of 2026 is when we expect occupancy.
Paul Farnan is Principal Deputy Assistant Army Secretary for Installations, Energy, and Environment. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And we'll post this interview along with a link to more information at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.